Hello, and welcome to History Changes on YouTube. I'm Dr. Philip W. Travis. If you also want to visit my webpage, philipwtravis.com, I have some information about my bio, publications, speaking arrangements, as well as some interesting history travel advice, which is under construction, but I'm working on it. So if you're interested in philipwtravis.com, give it a look. Today's video relates to a really important subject for modern liberal democracies. By liberal democracy, we mean representative government. We mean societies that champion the right of citizens to vote, societies that champion civil rights, civil liberties, and so forth. In the 21st century, we've seen a real rise in far-right movements in the world, and so it's perhaps more important than at any other time since to understand how the most infamous example of a fascist movement, the Nazis, rose to power within a liberal democracy, the Weimar Republic. So let's talk about this a little bit. The first thing we should think about here is to dispel a few common myths about the rise of the Nazis. One of the most common myths that I often hear from students is that the Treaty of Versailles was responsible. The Treaty of Versailles was this terrible treaty, and what you're looking at here is an anti-treaty poster about the Treaty of Versailles, the amount of territory, population, resources, and so forth that they would lose. That the Treaty of Versailles was this terrible treaty, and it necessitated the rise of the Nazis, and thereby the Nazis rose to power because of the Treaty of Versailles and World War II. That's a really huge oversimplification. The Treaty of Versailles was a harsh treaty. I think most would agree with that. But the Treaty of Versailles itself was not really responsible for the rise of the Nazis. A harsh treaty, yes. A part of Nazi propaganda, definitely. The anti-Treaty of Versailles was at the peak or the height of Nazi propaganda, or at the center of Nazi propaganda. But if we say that it was the Treaty of Versailles' fault, then we're basically saying, yeah, it was this treaty imposed upon the Germans, and then there's nothing that it was inevitable that the Nazis would rise. And that's really an oversimplification of how the Nazis came to power. Some other common myths are the Weimar Republic was doomed to fail. It was never working. It was always terrible. And it was just inevitably going to fail and give rise to far-right radicalism, which is tied to our first myth. Again, that's not entirely true. The Weimar Republic, following the hyperinflation of 1923, the Weimar Republic was to a large degree saved by Gustav Stresemann, who created international arrangements between the United States and other countries. And for about 5 years or so after 1923, the Weimar Republic was doing relatively pretty well. And the third myth, the Nazis overthrew the government forcefully. Also not true. They attempted to in 1923 in the infamous Beer Hall Putsch, but that failed, and failed miserably. And at the time, the Nazis were a pretty irrelevant political party as well. But the Nazis ultimately took power within the Weimar democracy through a political process. Some of it's a pseudo-political process. They had paramilitary. They had a large paramilitary force that by the early 1930s was larger than the German military was, the SA, and they were very intimidating, and they would intimidate voters and citizens. But aside from that, the Nazis were a political party. They ran for offices, they gave speeches, they did the things you expect political people to do, and gained their positions of power through the Weimar's constitutional processes. So it's really important to understand these, okay? The third one really tells us that there was a path for an anti-democratic movement to come to power through the democratic process. It wasn't as simple as just overthrowing the government. And that government itself was not just fundamentally failing, and it wasn't as simple as just something being imposed upon them. It was not as simple as the Treaty of Versailles. So we have to dispel these myths. Do those things factor in there? Were there problems with the Weimar government? Yes. Okay. Was there problems with where people were at in terms of their participation in political parties within Weimar? Yes. Was the Treaty of Versailles harsh? Yes. But those are really oversimplifications in understanding the rise of the Nazis in Germany. So let's think a little bit about this. So first of all, the greater context is the Great Depression. And this is a bank run on a United States bank. But the Great Depression was a global economic calamity. And prior to the Great Depression, as I mentioned, Gustav Stresemann in leadership in Weimar and the Weimar Republic had created international trade and loan agreements that really helped Weimar, the Weimar Republic, have some level of success for about 5 years. When the Great Depression happened, all of those types of arrangements fell apart across the world. And this sent countries, not simply the United States, sent countries all over the world into economic calamities. And of course, that was very much the case in Germany. Radical movements, whether they are communist on the left or fascist on the right, radical movements prey on times when populations find themselves in desperate straits. They appeal to people's emotions and provide simple solutions and answers to all that ails the country. This is the economic want and hardship, which is something that presidents like Franklin Roosevelt knew all too well. That economic want and hardship are the stuff that dictatorships are made of. That in those times, the appeal to people's emotions really caters to radicalism, whether it's on the left, communism, or on the right, fascism. So the context is the Great Depression. Let's think a little bit about the Nazis themselves. Nazi strategy. The overall Nazi strategy is to appeal to a ultranationalism. Fascism is ultranationalism on the right side of the spectrum. It's a far-right movement. It's an ultranationalism. For fascists, liberalism and internationalism is the central evil. There might be particular groups. Obviously, for the Nazis, the Jewish groups were the central group that was targeted, but it wasn't only Jewish groups. It was also socialists. It was also communists. It was those seen as engaging in publication and work that was seen as threatening to the sort of traditional notions of family, of sexuality, of marriage, of the nation that the Nazis put forth. But fascism is an appeal to ultranationalism. So you appeal to ultranationalist sentiments that you are trying to save the country and that you represent the country more than anything else. And these threats, these forces are seeking to destroy it. So support the fascists against the representative government to save your society. This is a propaganda poster from the infamous Nuremberg rallies that became, obviously, in the film Triumph of the Will. And that's what this is conveying, is that here, look, the Nazis are strong, and they are the most German of them all. And so fascist ultranationalism, the strategy is to basically use your ultranationalist appeal to people and to basically give people a central evil and a reason to understand why you claim that the nation is being destroyed. And so for fascists, the nation is made up of blank. There's a very rigid definition of the nation. And this is why, for liberal democracies, it's so dangerous, because liberal democracies embrace freedom of thought. Liberal democracies embrace diversity, freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, rights to publish, equal justice before the law, these types of things. In liberal democracies, all voices are supposed to matter, and people should be free to exercise them. Well, if you're an ultranationalism, then you assert that the nation is made of a really, really, really specific element that is being threatened by these other forces. And so, by necessity, the fascist country must eliminate people's individual freedoms to these types of things. They must eliminate people's freedoms to jurisprudence. They must eliminate people's freedoms to publications, to speak, to these types of things. So the nation is made up of blank. And this could be really any cultural ethnic group. For the Germans, of course, they said the nation is made up of quote-unquote Aryan Germans. But it could be, for different countries at different times, it could be any type of ethnic cultural group. It might not even have to be ethnic. It could be a particular cultural group. But the nation is made up of this specific thing. And liberalism and internationalism are invading and destroying the nation. And so the people must give up representative government to save the nation. That's how the ultranationalist fascist appeal works. The end goal for the Nazis, and for any fascist, it should say, is to eliminate democratic government. Now, for the Nazis, it was to create a racial empire for the so-called Aryan Volk. For a different case, it could be something else. It could be eliminating democratic government to create strength in this singular nation, whatever it might be, whatever the core of that might be. But that's the central goal for a fascist, is to eliminate democratic government, eliminate the protections that people have on civil liberties, on civil rights, on representative voice in the government, and replace it with an authoritarian government that will claim to purge the country, to eliminate the threat of liberalism and of internationalism from the country. That's the strategy. Appeal to ultranationalism. That's what they do. Okay, that's what the Nazis do. They're conveying, we are the most German. Even though they are a radical departure of anything that Germany really represents, they are insisting over and over again that they are the most German. They are ultranationalists. They are hyper-German. And all they're doing is trying to save Germany from these inherently anti-German elements that are infesting the country, basically. The tactics of the Nazis before they seize power, how they come to power. They have campaign rallies all the time. All the time. Down here you see a campaign rally. This is one of the more famous Nazi campaign rally pictures of Adolf Hitler in Weimar, Germany, in the seat of government in Germany in 1930. And this is the type of rally you would see. You would have the paramilitary SA there. You would have the brandishment of very, very sort of overt sort of displays of strength, various iconography, images on display there. So they did rallies constantly, getting people engaged and emotionally excited about what they're doing. Some of the rallies would include book burning. Some of them occurred at nights. They're creating almost like cultish atmosphere behind their rallies. Conspiratorial publications. This is one of the most infamous. Of course, you had other works like Mein Kampf, which Hitler wrote, but you also have their regular journal publications like Der Stürmer, which is right here, and this is an example. The story here is a narrative about your Aryan Nazi German who's poisoning the pestilence from the country, eliminating the sort of what it was called in the thing. It's called vermin, referring to Jewish people and liberalism in the country. But you have conspiratorial publications. Today you have your social media, you have information from all sides, but at that time there were other mediums of publication. So you do your rallies, but you also have the written print, and that's how you get these conspiracies out. And you convince people that your conspiracies, your fabrications are in fact somehow connected to reality. Connected to that is the use and misuse of history. Again, this ultranationalist sense that the Nazis convey that they're the most German, that no one could possibly be as German as them. They are this radical movement, but yet they're the ones with the flags everywhere that say we are the most German of all. And they claim this historical lineage to this. The notion that the Nazis were the Third Reich was a misuse of history. It was the idea that the Second Reich was during the chancellorship of Otto von Bismarck, and the original Reich went all the way back to King Charlemagne, back around 800 A.D. And so they claim this unique claim to history, that they were the most German of anyone. They claim martyrdom and persecution. Here you see Hitler with the blood flag, and this comes from the Beer Hall Putsch, this failed coup in 1923, where Hitler runs away. It's a miserable attempt at a coup, but there's some casualties, and coming out of this is the so-called blood flag. After the Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, Hitler was tried and given a criminal sentence. It was a short one. I think he served 6 months in prison. But the trial and the sentence gave him a public platform to say they're persecuting me. This liberal democracy is persecuting me. They're sending me to prison here when in fact all I want to do is save Germany. That all I'm doing is trying to fight for the German people. And so the incarceration, the short incarceration of 1923 at Landsberg prison, his martyrdom, claimed martyrdom from the beer hall putsch, is actually a key element of propaganda. It draws to the sympathy of people as they follow him. They are the persecuted people that are really the most German, and they're seeking to somehow save Germany. So Hitler would often save Germany. So Hitler would often show up with the so-called blood flag as a way of, sort of appealing to this emotional appeal to his martyrdom. Ultimately, the most basic tactic that all of that stuff builds on is political action. They use all of these items to become politically active and to win elections, also intimidating voters. So they win elections, but I say intimidating voters because, again, there's this massive paramilitary organization, the SA, which at its height was larger than the German military, and they were called the Brown Shirts, and they would go around and they would harass voters and these types of things. They were a threatening organization. But the Nazis are politically active. They seek to destroy the government. They campaign against the so-called treasonous parties of the country, which is basically every political party, your communist, your socialists in the country. They're all seen as these traitor parties, and they campaign against them intensely. And so they use the political system to their end. But they use misuse of history, conspiracies, rallies, constant information, and appeal to people's emotions to slowly, particularly in the context of the Great Depression, to slowly gain people's sort of allegiance. The last thing I want to say, after the Nazis seize power, what do? And this is why modern democracies need to be aware of this. We usually think about Nazi Germany. We think about this example, and we think about the most atrocious catastrophe in history, the Holocaust, the most atrocious human rights catastrophe in history in the way of the Holocaust and the development of the Second World War. But we sometimes miss, and we think about that, it's so extreme that we sometimes miss some of the more pertinent lessons for liberal democracies today. And that is the fundamental conflict between fascism and the concepts of a liberal democracy. Fascism is based on this rigid definition of the nation. The nation is made up of this very distinct group of people. And there is this force, liberalism and internationalism and other factors that are threatening that nation. That definition, that understanding of the nation means that inherently a fascist movement must and will eliminate freedoms that we champion in democratic societies, because to allow those freedoms would be allowing these sort of, as they would call them, traitor political parties and traitor ideas to function and potentially undermine the nation. So after the Nazis seized power, they imprisoned political opponents. They banned political parties. They banned books. They banned certain people from certain jobs. They close art studios and art displays because they are degenerative artwork. They regulate social behavior to an extensive degree. They put, how do they get away with doing all this? Is you implant Nazis in all level of government. If your police and your courts and your people administering the government are all sympathetic and are Nazis, then there's no check on what you can do in this way. So you implant Nazis on all level of government. This is something that the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, which means bringing into line, basically Nazifying society. And while you do that, you then persecute and drive out those people and those ideas that are regarded as the fundamental threat to the country. And for Germany, of course, this was Jewish people, communists, socialists, and the ideas associated with them. So burning the works of Karl Marx, burning the works of Sigmund Freud, and other other great minds and philosophers, driving out great thinkers like Albert Einstein or Henry Kissinger and many others that fled the Nazi persecution. So fascism has an inherently anti-democratic core. A fascist movement, if it comes to power, you cannot say, well, what's wrong with being ultra-nationalist? You're ultra-nationalist, all right. Well, being nationalist is not the same as being ultra-nationalist. You can go to a World Cup soccer game and cheer for your team and feel nationalist pride and not be a fascist, okay? If you're a nationalist, you can believe that all people get to be part of your country and be very patriotic. When you're a fascist, you're an ultra-nationalist, that means you have a very fundamentally rigid definition of what the nation is and who gets to be a part of that nation, who gets to participate in that nation. The reason you're ultra-nationalist is because you feel that that nation that you have defined is fundamentally under threat. And the core threat is, of course, liberalism. It is internationalism. The various ideas associated with it. And so as a result of that, the rise of fascism in a democratic society, which historically has come through political action, through continual rallying, to the appeal to history, the misuse of history, to conspiratorial ideas that are used in significant levels throughout society to convince people of an alternative understanding of what's reality in society. The appeal to emotions through the idea of martyrdom and these types of things. Fascist movements come to power through the democratic process. But they're not democratic. And when they take power, fascist movements must, as an inherent offshoot of their philosophy, of their idea of looking at the world, they must eliminate those threats to society. And that means a loss of the very core notions that representative governments, that democratic liberal democracies hold very close. And these are civil liberties and civil rights and representative government, the idea that you should have a right to equal justice before the law or equal treatment before the law, the idea that you should have a right to be free from censorship, the right that you have the individual liberty to speak, to protest, to demonstrate, to pursue your goals without the intrusion or the effect of the government, of unfair persecution by the government. And so fascism is inherently opposed to liberal democracy. And this is why in the 21st century, citizens of liberal democracies really must be wary and to guard against fascist elements who champion positions against purging society from certain notions of liberalism, of internationalism, that appeal to this, because these are very dangerous ideas that possess the potential for extreme action if they were to take power. So democracies really need to be vigilant against these ideas. Again, this is History Changes on YouTube. I'm Dr. Philip W. Travis.